The dawn over Empress Augusta Bay was thin and gray, a sheet of mist stretched low across a sea that had known too many battles. On the bridge of an amphibious command ship, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandegrift watched the horizon with the kind of concentration that erases everything but the task at hand. Below, Marines checked the straps on LCVPs and adjusted helmets. Off to starboard, the silhouette of the island, Bougainville, rose like a shadowed promise. It was November 1, 1943, and the men preparing to touch that beach carried in their hands a strategic problem that had been growing for more than a year: a great, fortified Japanese base at Rabaul, looming like an unsinkable fortress on the map of the South Pacific. Rabaul had a reputation the Allies found hard to ignore. Nestled on the tip of New Britain, its Simpson Harbor offered the natural protection of a deep, sheltered anchorage. From the hills around the town, coastal batteries could command the approaches. Intelligence reports and captured documents, later confirmed by post-war research, described multiple airfields clustered within a short distance, extensive tunnel complexes carved into volcanic rock, concrete revetments, layers of anti-aircraft emplacements, and a garrison force that Allied planners often cited at roughly 100,000 to 110,000 men. To American and Australian commanders, even before the first boots landed at Bougainville, Rabaul looked like more than a base. It looked like a strategic anchorage that, if left unchecked, could dominate the arc of the Central and South Pacific campaigns. When an enemy accumulates guns, planes, and men in a place like that, the immediate instinct of military culture is often the same: to take it. Storm the beaches, fight the bloody fight, and remove the threat. That had been the pattern in other Pacific engagements. At Guadalcanal, at Buna, at Tarawa, forces had battled for ground that enemies believed was indispensable. The human cost of those fights, men trapped in island jungles, clogged shorelines under heavy fire, frontal assaults against fortified positions, was seared into the planning brains of American commanders. But Rabaul posed a problem of scale. It was not a single island with one airstrip. It was a networked, defended base whose sheer mass invited a least favored alternative: a frontal assault that, by many practical calculations, would be horrendous in blood and resources. So the paradox landed in the middle of strategy rooms, like a cold coin. How do you defeat what looks invincible? The U.S. response, as it unfolded, was neither a single act of genius nor an avoidance born of cowardice. It was instead a steady, bureaucratic, sometimes messy exercise in arithmetic, logistics, and the sober politics of wartime priorities. In short, they ignored the fortress by design. They chose to make it irrelevant. That decision did not come easily. It was preceded by a string of attempts to neutralize or at least blunt Rabaul's power: air raids, low-level attacks, and carrier strikes, some spectacular, some costly, many demonstrating the limits of what air power alone could achieve against a heavily defended, dispersed base. One early poignant story stands out. Brigadier General Kenneth N. Walker, a senior aviator known for aggressive tactics and the championing of daylight precision bombing from high altitude, led missions that probed Japan's southern defenses. On one such mission against the enemy's installations, Walker failed to return. He did not survive to see the strategic debates that would follow his loss, and his fate became a sober reminder of the human stakes behind the abstract numbers on staff maps. Major Raymond Wilkins was another name that the airmen of the Pacific whispered with a mixture of praise and grief, an experienced aviator killed during efforts to suppress Japanese air power. Their deaths were not isolated tragedies. They were part of a pattern that shaped the calculus of commanders above them. By late 1943, the scale of effort required to compel a decisive result against Rabaul, if an assault were chosen, had started to be measured in projections and percentages. General George C. Marshall and other members of the High Command began to stress a blunt arithmetic. The Pacific theater was vast. The demands of Europe and other operations made troops and shipping scarce. Casualties from a frontal attack on a major base could be staggeringly high. Past island campaigns provided painful precedents. Tara was bloody, confined beaches had produced casualty rates that shocked the American public and political leadership. Guadalcanal's length and intensity had demonstrated how limited port facilities and supply lines could make a great contest of attrition. Those experiences were not theoretical background color. They were the practical memory the Joint Chiefs had in their minds when they considered the cost of taking Rabaul. At the same time, technical and tactical developments suggested alternatives to the textbook solution of capturing everything. Air power was growing in range and precision. Carrier task forces had struck at distant targets and demonstrated reach that had once, in earlier wars, been the stuff of fantasy. New bombing techniques, skip bombing for low-altitude attacks on ships, concentrated low-level strafing to suppress defending fighters on the ground, and the more familiar high-altitude attacks by medium and heavy bombers expanded the options available to commanders. Submarines could interdict shipping lines. Engineers could build airfields on nearby islands in weeks rather than the months it took to capture and garrison a heavily defended base. The decision did not spring from a single meeting or a dramatic showdown. It emerged from the slow, grinding work of staff officers comparing losses at Tarawa and Guadalcanal, of admirals plotting fuel and convoy calculations, of airmen showing the reach of carriers and long-range bombers, and of politicians anxious about public reaction to mass casualties. The meeting at Quebec and other high-level conferences crystallized what the joint planners had been nudging toward. The idea that Rabaul could be neutralized through isolation, seizing nearby positions to build air bases, applying sustained air and sea interdiction, and essentially removing Rabaul's value by preventing it from supporting operations. The language used by planners was striking in its bluntness. "How many Marines is Rabaul worth?" became a grim shorthand in staff rooms when debating whether to assault a major enemy bastion. It is not a phrase to romanticize. It reduces human lives to ledger entries and rightly evokes discomfort. But it is also an accurate reflection of operational thinking in wartime. Commanders must compare the cost in men against the strategic return. That arithmetic rarely makes headlines, but it shapes wars. That calculus carried weight because the United States did not have the luxury to pursue every apparent objective simultaneously. Army divisions were being readied for other assaults. Ships were being allocated to multiple theaters, and the logistical trains, ammunition, aviation fuel, construction equipment had to be managed with ruthless efficiency. Any assault on Rabaul would have required a coalition of assets, overwhelming naval fire support to suppress coastal batteries, massive pre-landing bombardments, sustained air superiority to keep Japanese reinforcements from intervening, and the capacity to supply and rotate tens of thousands of assault troops across long ocean lines. Planners ran the numbers and compared projected casualties against what could be achieved by a strategy that instead seized adjacent islands, built airstrips, and used air and submarine forces to strangle Rabaul's ability to operate. There were moral and political pressures too. The Allied moral purpose demanded victory, and at home the public equated sweeping, decisive victories with justice. Some political leaders and newsmen were uncomfortable with the idea of leaving a major enemy base standing inside the arc of Allied operations. The idea of bypassing a fortified position carried the risk of appearing to leave danger active or of allowing perceived unfinished business, which could have both domestic and inter-service consequences. Those anxieties fed into the debates, but they did not ultimately swamp the stricter operational considerations. In deliberations, the Joint Chiefs and the Strategic Committee repeatedly returned to the twin constraints of casualty projections and resource allocation. The argument for bypassing rested on two pillars: that the Allied forces could, by taking the right neighboring positions and applying air and sea power, render Rabaul functionally impotent, and that doing so would save a large number of American and Allied lives compared with a direct assault. That reasoning did not mean Rabaul would fade quietly, nor did it absolve commanders from hard tactical choices or the responsibility to contain the garrison. It meant rather a long game of encirclement that required patience, engineering skill, and continued willingness to accept the attrition of aerial campaigns. Rabaul would still be bombed. Carriers and land-based aircraft would continue to attack its shipping and airfields. Submarines would pick off supply runs. Isolated islands would be seized not for glamour but to host airfields from which Allied aircraft could reduce enemy mobility. The strategy would impose its own costs, including continued aircrew losses and the moral difficulty of leaving many enemy soldiers alive to subsist in a shrinking domain. Those costs were weighed, consciously, against the catastrophic alternative of a full-scale invasion. In the Filipino theater and in the wider contest over the Pacific, the debate over Rabaul was an emblematic case of shifting military thought. Where once commanders assumed the decisive fight would be a literal capture of territory, experience and technology began to show that denying an enemy the ability to operate could be as decisive as possession itself. For planners stretching from Washington to Brisbane, that shift was both instructive and uncomfortable. It required accepting that victory could be achieved by exclusion, by making an important place irrelevant rather than by occupation. The human stories threaded through the debate were not lost in the calculus. The pilots and sailors who had pressed attacks against Rabaul felt the blows and the losses. The men who would one day march onto newly seized islands in the Solomons and beyond did so with an awareness that they were executing a larger plan as much as engaging an immediate enemy. Some of the most visible and poignant of these human costs were the aviators who flew early, costly missions against Rabaul. Walker's disappearance during those raids and Wilkins' death were not abstract casualties on a chart. They were concrete examples of the price exacted by attempts to unseat a heavily defended base without the full support an invasion would have demanded. Their names entered the operational memory of the theater and were part of the moral ledger the Joint Chiefs considered when they narrowed their options. By the time the Joint Chiefs issued a directive accepting a strategy of bypass and isolation, it was the culmination of layered reasoning. Tactical experiments had demonstrated both the potential and limits of air and naval strikes. Operational experience from prior campaigns had warned of the human cost of frontal assaults. And strategic necessity, pressures of shipping, manpower, and competing theaters had constrained the appetite for another colossal attritional battle. The directive that emerged did not order abandoning the contest over Rabaul. It ordered a different kind of contest. Instead of an invasion, the Allies would seize key positions in the periphery, build air bases, and wage an interdiction campaign that aimed to choke Rabaul's ability to support offensive operations. Within American staffs, the change of posture was described in sober, technical terms, but it produced images almost cinematic in their consequences. Islands ringed by American airstrips, night after night of bombing that cratered runways and made repair costly. Submarine patrols waiting for the convoys that sometimes tried to risk the route to Rabaul. Carrier task forces roaming the seas to blunt Japanese attempts to reinforce. To Japanese commanders, the reversal must have felt like a slow strangulation. A great base with thousands of men trapped inside while the wider war moved on. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commanding naval elements that supported the Rabaul garrison, found that his ability to support and resupply those forces was being steadily compromised by Allied control of the sea lanes and by the expansion of Allied air power from new bases on neighboring islands. On the morning Vandegrift watched the pale light over Bugili, the Marines he commanded were about to become actors in the implementation of that strategy. The landing at Empress Augusta Bay was, on its surface, a tactical operation against a single island. In the larger view, it was part of the web of moves intended to isolate Rabaul by constructing a chain of airfields and denying the Japanese freedom to project force beyond their fortress. The troops who ran the beaches that day, building positions, clearing fields, and enduring counterattacks, were not storming Rabaul's gates. Instead, they were taking the approach that the planners had chosen, edging closer to the enemy's lodestone and using their seizure of peripheral ground to shrink Rabaul's operational space. Even as commanders accepted bypassing as policy, the question of perception remained alive. The American public, conditioned by images of decisive assaults and by rhetoric that favored the annihilation of enemy capability, might struggle with a strategy that left a large enemy force alive and intact within a perimeter. Politically, leaders were aware that successful implementation depended not just on military effectiveness, but on maintaining public confidence that the war was being won. Thus, the Allied press and public messaging had to balance frankness about the prudence of bypassing with reassurance that the neutralized base would not threaten future operations. The military, for its part, took pains to ensure that action followed the logic of planning. Bypass would not be a euphemism for indifference. It would be an active, sustained campaign of interdiction. We can see then how the decision to ignore Rabaul was less an instance of avoidance than a choice among hard trade-offs. It grew from a loop of evidence. Raids and losses showed the base's resilience. Strategic needs and logistic constraints made a costly invasion undesirable. Operational lessons from prior island battles suggested alternatives, and tactical capabilities, long-range bombers, carriers, submarines, and the ability to build airfields quickly on neighboring islands made a non-assault strategy plausible. That combination led leaders to adopt what might at first glance appear paradoxical: to render an invincible fortress irrelevant by never engaging it directly at its strongest point. The consequences of that choice would be messy, morally ambiguous, and operationally complex. It would play out in months of operations that combined frontline combat with attritional air campaigns, in engineering feats that transformed small islands into pivotal air bases, and in the slow, grinding reduction of Japanese capacity to maneuver. For the men trapped in the fortress's interior, the outcome would be deprivation and confinement rather than immediate roaring annihilation. For the Allied war effort, the payoff would be less visible glory and more sustained forward momentum at reduced human cost. To understand precisely how the Allies executed the plan, how sieges were effected without sieges, how air power and logistics were integrated to shut down a once mighty base, we must follow the sequence of operations that flowed from the Joint Chiefs' decision. The stage was set. Men like Vandegrift were moving into position. Air commanders were preparing sorties that would try to keep Japanese runways unusable. Carrier captains and submarine skippers were being given missions designed to intercept supply ships before they reached shelter. Across the theater, engineers awaited the signal to begin building airstrips on small, newly won islands. In staff rooms, officers checked their calendars and their shipping manifests, counting days and tons of fuel and munitions, and recomputing the arithmetic that had decided the question. The choice to bypass Rabaul had been made not in the heat of a single moment, but through the cold precision of strategic calculation. What remained was the execution of that calculation across hundreds of miles of ocean, in storms and under fire, over weeks and months that would test the patience of men and the limits of machines. What happened next would not be immediate resolution. It would be a campaign of attrition conducted by proxies. Airfields, carriers, subs, and small landings, each move eroding Rabaul's capacity. But before these mechanisms could be fully described in detail, it's worth stopping to remember the human faces embedded in that arithmetic. The aviators who struck Rabaul early, the sailors who patrolled the shipping lanes, the Marines who pressed ashore on islands that would host new airfields. They were all participants in a strategy that implicitly judged value and cost. Some of them paid the price of a strategy that avoided wholesale invasion. Flight crews lost in night bombing, sailors taken by torpedoes, soldiers wounded clearing fields for runways. Others survived to see the strategic logic vindicated by months of successful interdiction. And for the Japanese soldiers left inside Rabaul, the choice meant slow isolation, a dwindling of supplies, and a long wait that would test morale and endurance in its own terrible way. The moment of decision, when the Joint Chiefs and the theater commanders agreed to transform Rabaul from an invincible fortress into a contained, immobile liability, was thus both technical and profoundly human. It reflected the growing capacity of Allied arms to project power without occupation, And it reflected a willingness to measure sacrifice against strategic return. The payoff would be judged in lower American casualties and an accelerated Allied timetable in the Pacific. The moral cost would be counted in men left to endure a siege of attrition and in the names of those like Walker and Wilkins who had fallen in earlier attempts to blunt the enemy's strength. As the first landings at Bougainville began, as new airstrips were planned and night raid schedules sketched, the Allies moved from theory into action. The operational machinery hummed to life. Logistics officers requisitioned bulldozers and steel matting. Carrier task forces drew sea lanes that would define reach. Naval intelligence plotted likely convoy routes to interdict. The strategy's success would depend on the painstaking integration of these elements and on the persistence of Allied commanders to sustain pressure for months on end. The dramatic, costly land assault the Japanese might have expected never materialized. Instead, Rabaul would find itself besieged by distance, patience, and unrelenting attrition. But that siege and its consequences would unfold over the coming campaigns. Vella la Vella and the seizure of Bougainville, the grinding advance through New Guinea that opened Hollandia and other bases, and the naval and air interdictions that steadily choked supply lines from Truk and the Solomon Islands. Those operations, to be carried out by thousands of men and hundreds of ships and aircraft, would test the logic that had guided the decision, that a carefully applied strategy of bypass and isolation could achieve what a frontal assault would have done at vastly greater cost. The next chapters of the campaign would show whether the arithmetic that had convinced the Joint Chiefs would deliver not only reduced casualties, but also a decisive shift in momentum across the Pacific theater. What follows is the story of that execution, the sequence of landings and air campaigns, the innovations in tactics that made interdiction effective, and the human costs left in the wake of strategic prudence. It is a story of engineers racing to turn coral atolls into airstrips, of submariners stalking supply convoys under moonless skies, of carrier aviators pressing dangerous low-level attacks and, sometimes, never returning. It is the story of how a massive, heavily garrisoned base came to be written off not by a single victorious assault, but by a patient, coordinated squeeze that reshaped the course of a war. The Allied squeeze began not with a single thunderbolt, but with a series of deliberate outward moves, small landings, hurried airstrips, submarine ambushes, and carrier sorties that together formed a ring. Each action had its own tactical purpose, but together they were an operational pattern. Take the neighboring high ground, build an airbase, and use the airbase to close the noose. It was a patient, cumulative logic. Deprive Rabaul of its ability to reach beyond its harbor, and its reputation as an unsinkable aircraft carrier would wither. If you follow the map, the pattern is easy to read. Vella la Vella and the Northern Solomons were seized to interrupt Japanese lines of communication and to deny nearby staging areas. Bougainville, the site of the dramatic November landing we have already seen through Vandegrift's eyes, offered space for long-range fighters and medium bombers once airstrips were established. Cape Gloucester on New Britain and the Green Islands were taken to tighten that ring and to provide forward bases for fighters escorting bombers attacking Rabaul. Hollandia, taken in April 1944 under MacArthur's command, opened large airfields on New Guinea's northern coast, giving Allied air planners even greater reach into the Bismarcks. Each seizure did not confront Rabaul on its strongest side. It denied Rabaul the operational freedom to interfere with Allied moves elsewhere. After Bougainville's beaches were secured, engineers and Seabees moved with a speed that surprised older assumptions about construction in the South Pacific. Where earlier campaigns had sometimes waited months for usable strips, by late 1943 and early 1944, the Allies had learned to lay graded coral and marston matting and to place runways where geography and tides permitted rapid buildup. Within weeks of landings, P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts were operating from newly completed fields, extending fighter cover for medium bomber strikes and dramatically reducing the time between takeoff and target. Those fighters did more than escort. They contested Japanese air patrols, kept enemy fighters pinned down on their fields, and made daytime movement across sea lanes riskier. The air campaign itself evolved as technique and experience accumulated. Early mass raids had underscored the problem. Dispersed airfields, rapid repair crews, and abundant protective revetments meant that a single raid, even a very large one, would not permanently silence an airbase. The solution combined frequency with varied methods. Night bombing cratered runways repeatedly, forcing repair crews into a continuous cycle of work and removal. Low-level attacks, including skip bombing for anti-ship work and wave-after-wave strafing to suppress parked aircraft, raised the price of simply waiting out an attack. Carrier strikes added the crucial flexibility. Fleet aircraft could appear unexpectedly and, if necessary, retire under the screen of their carriers. Submarines enforced the blockade seaward, sinking transports and escorts and making supply runs perilous. One operation deserves attention as both a tactical innovation and a moral moment. In the months after the Bougainville landings, crews from medium and heavy bombers and carrier fighters began to refine coordinated attacks that deliberately targeted the junctions of supply, wharves, barges, and the narrow approaches to Simpson Harbor. The strategy was not to obliterate the town or to annihilate every soldier within Rabaul's hills. It was to make the harbor a costly place for Japanese logistics. Every transport forced to anchor under air attack would either be turned away or risk loss. Over time, the cumulative attrition of shipping had strategic significance. A base that could not be resupplied could not project power. That outcome relied on a web of small, often invisible victories. A submarine on patrol in the Bismarcks would radio a sighting. A convoy would reroute or attempt the nighttime run that invited surface or aerial ambush. A carrier task group would be vectored to intercept, launching strikes that sank ships or forced them to scatter. On other nights, heavy bombers would crater runways, and repair crews would labor under blackout to fill them, only to have them cratered again in the next week's sortie. The cumulative effect was exhaustion and delay on the Japanese side, and a growing inability to mount coordinated offensive operations out of Rabaul. Those who oversaw these operations were careful to measure success not by spectacular single-day tallies, but by trends. Admiral William F. Halsey and the carrier's captains learned the leverage of being able to strike across ranges that had seemed improbable a year earlier. General George Kenney's air forces demonstrated that with concerted effort and forward basis, they could reach the Bismarcks on a scale that made defense progressively costly. Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's carrier strikes, while they did not seize territory, illustrated that fleet aviation could strike deep and return to sea. Each of these actors contributed pieces to the larger enterprise. None of them alone won the campaign. It was combined arms, persistent pressure, and logistical attrition that achieved the strategic end. At sea, the interdiction war took on a grim cat-and-mouse quality. Japanese attempts to run transports in darkness or under escort were repeatedly frustrated. Convoys that had once been routine became risky propositions. The more attempts that failed or were costly, the fewer the convoys willing to tempt the route. The Japanese fleet, already stretched and increasingly preoccupied with defending inner lines, had to make choices: where to commit escorts and when to risk transports. Those choices favored the Allies, because Allied planners only had to make the sea lanes unreliable. They did not have to forbid every single delivery. A few turned-back convoys, a handful of torpedoed transports, and the steady loss of tonnage steadily eroded Rabaul's capacity. Inside the fortress, the effect was visible and human. Men who had once expected to be sent forward lay in bunkers and tunnels, eating what rations remained and tending small gardens where they could. For Japanese commanders, the situation created a terrible arithmetic of their own. conserve ammunition, limit sorties, and hope that the wider war's tides would shift. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka and the local command had to balance the demands of maintaining morale with the practical limits of supply. Over time, the Japanese garrison grew less dangerous not because it was broken by invasion, but because it was starved of the means to act beyond its perimeter. The moral implications of that reality were not lost on Allied officers. To accept isolation as a tool of war meant accepting that large numbers of enemy soldiers would remain alive inside encircled areas, and that many might die slowly from disease and lack of supplies rather than from direct combat. It was a difficult truth, and one that sat uneasily with the visceral appetite for decisive, visible victories that newspapers and political leaders sometimes demanded. But commanders answered to an obligation no less moral: to steward their own forces and to minimize unnecessary slaughter among their troops while still achieving strategic aims that would save more lives over time. The human vignettes threaded through these months helped to keep that moral complexity in focus. We have already mentioned Brigadier General Kenneth Walker and Major Raymond Wilkins, two names that became shorthand for the price that air crews paid in those early attempts to blunt Rabaul's power. There were others whose personal stories plugged the abstract debate into flesh. Patrol boat captains and destroyer skippers who ran dangerous night pickets, CB foremen who slept under tents beside half-built runways, and young Marine riflemen who came ashore to clear coconut groves that would become the foundation for forward strips. All these gave the bypass strategy its operational teeth. Individual courage was not absent from the campaign. It was simply integrated into a different strategic logic than that of the frontal assault. Valor continued to matter, but it was now applied to tasks that aimed at attrition and denial as much as at capture. The operational tempo of these moves had a second-order effect. It accelerated plans elsewhere. By denying Rabaul the ability to mount large-scale operations, the Allies freed resources for the Central Pacific thrust and for further operations in New Guinea and the Philippines. Ships and aircraft that would otherwise have been absorbed in a protracted siege could be redistributed. That redistribution mattered in a war that turned on margins. A carrier group here, a squadron there, could tip the balance in a different theater when it would otherwise have been tied down in an assault of contested beaches and fortifications. One of the most revealing measures of the bypass's success was not how many bombs fell on Rabaul in a single raid, but how seldom Japanese surface forces left the Bismarcks after 1943. The Imperial Navy, conscious of mounting losses and the growing danger of Allied carrier raids, gradually withdrew larger fleet elements to preserve forces for contests deemed decisive. Truk, once a linchpin of Japanese anchorage in the Central Pacific, lost much of its earlier activity as fuel and escort shortages mounted. For the garrison at Rabaul, that meant fewer chances of large-scale reinforcement and dwindling hope that relief fleets would break the isolation. The campaign also evolved technically. Allied planners improved intelligence collection, signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and local coastwatcher reports that refined target lists and convoy patterns. Bomb damage assessment became more accurate, helping air crews to prioritize repairs and re-attack sites that impeded enemy movement. Engineering logistics learned to operate across distances. Bridges of supply were built from Australia, New Guinea, and forward islands to support these forward airfields. The arithmetic that had once been a theoretical ledger in Washington and Brisbane became operational reality. Fewer troops ashore, more air sorties per target, and a sustained attritional grind against enemy logistics. By mid-1944, the visible signs of Rabaul's loss of reach were clear. Air sorties from newly occupied islands reduced the harbor's use. Shipping losses mounted. The Japanese aviation units assigned there were kept largely defensive, and the theater's initiative had shifted. That shift was the payoff the Joint Chiefs and the committee had anticipated.
It did not look like a single glorious triumph. It looked like a strategic terrain that had been altered by time, attrition, and the steady application of combined arms. Yet the campaign's human cost, though different from a single bloody invasion, was still significant. Air crews continued to be shot down on interdiction missions. Submariners were lost to depth charges and hazardous sea conditions. Ground forces suffered casualties taking and holding the islands that became the scaffolding for the air campaign. And for those inside Rabaul, the cost was often starvation and disease. Historians estimate that substantial numbers of Japanese troops died of illness or malnutrition during the period of isolation. Precise tallies vary and are contested, but the broad pattern is painfully evident. The result was a form of attrition that spared Allied assault forces many thousands of casualties. Estimates of lives saved are debated and must be presented cautiously, but that nonetheless left a grim toll among the besieged. In command rooms, the decision to bypass grew less controversial as results accumulated. MacArthur, who had been cautious about leaving a strong base in his rear, gradually accepted the operational reality that the seizure of peripheral islands and the opening of nearby airfields was producing strategic utility. General Marshall's emphasis on economy of force found vindication in the accelerated tempo of operations that followed. When resources were freed from interminable sieges, they could be committed to drives that ultimately cut Japan's strategic depth further. The Joint Chiefs' earlier arithmetic did not magically answer every question, but its prudence was borne out by the campaign's operational outcomes. For the Japanese High Command, the bypass strategy produced an ugly lesson. Large defensive concentrations, once thought to be the key to holding ground, could be neutralized by a combination of isolation and air-sea denial. Political and cultural expectations complicated their response. Japanese doctrine and prestige often emphasized the duty to hold territory to the last. Yet supply realities and the threat of Allied counteraction forced choices that, in the end, could not save every garrison. In the endgame, the psychological effect of knowing that your base had been made strategically irrelevant, surrounded by enemy air power, watched by submarines, unable to project strength, was devastating to morale. What, however, did not happen is also important to report. There was no single climactic assault into Rabaul, no symbolic fall of a fortress in photographs. Instead, surrender and capitulation came at the war's end, when the global collapse of Japanese logistics and the cumulative effect of Allied offensives stripped away whatever coherence remained. For the garrison, surrender was the endpoint of a slow deprivation. For the Allies, it was the confirmation that the bypass had worked in strategic terms.
The final months of the war added the final layers of consequence. Once the Central Pacific campaigns began delivering decisive blows, Saipan, the Marianas, the invasion of the Philippines, the material and symbolic need to neutralize Rabaul by direct attack diminished. The axis of strategic effort shifted toward mainland Japan's approaches and toward the massive raids that would eventually bring the war to its close. In that broader arc, the decision to bypass had conserved Allied strength for far more decisive operations. In reflecting on the campaign, there are several lessons that command attention. First, warfare is as much arithmetic as it is heroism. The choice to isolate Rabaul was grounded in hard numbers, shipping allocations, casualty projections, and aircraft sortie rates that forced leaders to reconcile the desire for decisive visible victories with the obligation to preserve combat power. Second, technological and tactical innovation matter, but they must be integrated into operational concepts. Skip bombing, repeated runway craterings, carrier flexibility, and submarine interdiction were each useful, but their strategic value emerged when combined around a coherent plan. Third, command decisions are collective. The bypass was not a single person's insight. It emerged from committees, staff work, and a series of commanders and planners whose cumulative reasoning produced a new shape for the campaign. And finally, the human dimension refuses to be sanitized. The calls made in staff rooms had human equivalents on coral beaches, in engine rooms, and in mountain tunnels. The men who dug, flew, pushed, and sometimes died. Those human stories are integral to the campaign's meaning. They remind us that strategic prudence does not remove moral responsibility. It only reframes the kinds of sacrifices that war demands. The epilogue of the story is simple in outline and complex in detail. Rabaul survived the war as a garrison strongpoint, reduced in operational importance and slowly starving of its ability to project force. Its garrison was surrendered and repatriated in the aftermath of Japan's capitulation. Some soldiers returned home, many having suffered terribly in nutrition and disease. Japanese commanders like Junichi Kusaka carried the weight of their commands through to the war's end, their choices constrained by an increasingly untenable logistical reality. Allied commanders, Vandegrift, Kinney, Halsey, Sherman, and the staffs that supported them saw their collective approach vindicated in the broader campaign's momentum. Historians continue to debate exact numbers and the counterfactuals of what might have happened had commanders chosen differently. Such debates are useful, but cannot replace the observable facts of what was chosen and what ensued. Rabaul today is not the volcanic strongpoint it was in 1943. The scars of war, cratered runways, disused bunkers, and the remains of tunnels are visible in parts, and memorials remember the men on both sides. Villages have often grown where military installations once loomed. The sea returns to its peaceful commute of small fishing boats rather than convoys of transport ships. The physical traces are a reminder that even seemingly permanent fortresses can be reduced to historical landscapes by choices made far away from the bunkers, by the slow arithmetic of strategy, by engineering ingenuity, and by the quiet bravery of service members who built the scaffolding of isolation. So why did the United States ignore Rabaul? The short answer is that it did not ignore Rabaul through neglect. It neutralized Rabaul through calculated, coordinated action that chose the harder moral arithmetic of preserving lives over the immediate spectacle of a head-on assault. The fortress was treated as a problem to be contained, not necessarily as a prize to be taken at any cost. And what happened next was a widening of Allied operational freedom. Islands seized to host airfields, sea lanes contested by submarines, runways cratered nightly, and naval aviation extending reach in ways previously unimaginable. The long-term payoff was strategic momentum, a redistribution of resources into operations that proved decisive elsewhere, and, by several historians' estimates, a substantial reduction in American and Allied casualties compared with what a full-scale assault would likely have produced. This is not a tidy or wholly comfortable moral. Bypassing Rabaul saved many lives that would have been lost in a frontal assault, but it left thousands of enemy soldiers to endure a harsh, drawn-out isolation, and left families on both sides to carry questions that war never fully answers. The decision to bypass was not a triumph of sentimentality. It was a hard, sometimes unpleasant judgment call grounded in operational realities. It changed the nature of the Pacific War and, in doing so, helped accelerate the Allied path to eventual victory. If this look at the South Pacific raises questions for you about the operations, the commanders, or the human stories, leave a comment and tell us which forgotten corner of World War II you want us to explore next. The story of Rabaul is not a single moment, but a sequence of choices, each with its cost and consequence, and each worth remembering. In the end, the Invincible fortress was not defeated by a single heroic storming party. It was made irrelevant by a strategy that married patience to precision. Take the neighboring ground, build the airfields, cut the supplies, and let the base's power erode. It is a case study in how modern warfare, when it must, chooses exclusion over annihilation, arithmetic over swagger, and the hard stewardship of lives over the allure of symbolic conquest. That is why the United States ignored the fortress. And what happened next was the slow, relentless unmaking of a strategic anchor, not by the thunder of landing craft on its beaches, but by the steady application of air, sea, and engineering power from the rings it could not escape.